Hello friends, welcome to Chess Frolics. Here is an amazing problem by KRALIN, White to play and win. Now if you are ready, let us start with the solution. Black has a pawn on g2 which is about to queen, and white can stop either by bishop to f2 or king to f2. But bishop to f2 runs into pawn promoting with a queen. So that move is out of question because after queening it is black who is winning. So white starts with king to f2, preventing the pawn from queening. Black can either take the pawn on h4, but the bishop will take the pawn on e5, and it will be an easy win for white. So black advances the pawn to f4, attacking the bishop. Now white can either take the pawn on g5 or advance the pawn or take the f4 pawn with the bishop. Suppose if white goes for the g5 pawn, black will simply advance the pawn to h4, attacking the bishop once again. If the bishop takes, pawn takes, and if any of the pawn advances, the king comes to h2, or if the white king comes to g1, black king will come to g3, and any of the pawn can advance and mate the white king. So even that move doesn't work. So that is why the best move for white is d7, advancing the pawn and forgetting about these two threats. Pawn advances to d5. Black takes the bishop on g3, giving a check. The king has to come to g1, and now the white king is blocked from all sides, cannot move to any of the squares. At any time, if any pawn, h pawn comes to h2, it will be a mate. Now black smartly advances the pawn to g4 instead of moving out the king, allowing the white to promote the pawn on d7. Now white can promote the pawn on d7, but if white promotes to a queen or to a bishop, it is going to be a stalemate, as the bishop or the queen protects the pawn on h4 and black has no moves. Suppose in case if white promotes the pawn to a knight, black takes the pawn, knight comes to f7, protecting the g5 square. The black king moves back. White takes the pawn on e5. The king comes h4. If the black will smartly advance h4, and now whatever move white makes, black has no move, and it is a stalemate. So the best thing white can do is promote the pawn to a rook. Now black has no moves. Black has only one move, and black can take the pawn on h4. White can move the rook to d7, e8 or g8. Now let us see which move is more correct. Rook comes to d7, attacking the pawn on a7, after which the rook will move and the a pawn can advance to a queen. But black brings out the king to g5. And now if rook takes the pawn on a7, black will simply move the king to g6, preventing the rook from coming to h7, as the h pawn is slowly going to advance to h2, delivering a mate. So rook to d7 does not work. If rook comes to e8, attacking the e pawn, the king comes out to g5, rook e5 check, and the king will not move to on the f file, or else the h pawn will be lost. So the king just simply moves to g6, protecting the h pawn. But suppose in case if the king goes to h4 inside, white will just simply make a waiting move, rook anywhere on the 5th rank. King has to move, and rook into h5 will be mate. But rook e8 doesn't work because black will not go back to h4, but black will bring the king to g6, again preventing the rook from coming anywhere. So now the best move for white is rook to g8, preventing the king from coming out to g5. So the king has to go to h3. Now white has a very brilliant move, a waiting move, rook to g6. Again waiting for in case if the king comes to h4, then the rook moves to a favorable square where white will get a white will have to lose a tempo, and that we'll see how the position comes in the end once again. So king comes to h4. Now white has to make another waiting move, rook to g7. Again king to h3. And now rook comes to b7. Black moves the pawn to h4 or king to h4. But if black comes to h4, if the king comes to h4, the rook will simply take the a7 pawn because black has a move. King to h3, and then the rook can just come to h7, waiting for black to either move the king or the pawn, and he can sacrifice his rook here and promote the pawn. So white is just waiting with rook to b7, but black smartly closes all roads to the king by moving the pawn to h4. Now, if rook takes the pawn or rook moves anywhere on the seventh on the b file, it is a stalemate. But white has a smarter move. White will just moves the bishop to b6, and now black has to take the rook. So this is in this way white sacrifices the rook, giving black a move so that his pawn can advance and promote. So after the rook is taken, a7, b5, and now promoting to a queen again will not give white anything because the king is covered by its own pieces, own pawns. So the white queen cannot reach the king. That is why white has to promote to a knight. Now black has a move, b4, knight to c7, b3, knight to e6. And now can you see why white promoted to a knight? b2. And the final move, knight to g5, a brilliant smothered mate by white. What a smothered mate. I hope you have enjoyed the chess composition. Thank you very much.